It's amazing that Kaunas, it's me, that Kaunas makes such wonderful links. I'm a translator, essay writer, and lived in Cyprus for a very long time, and wrote several essays about you, and several times spoke in various conferences about your language. What I used to define your language transformed by travel is fatigue of homelessness. Now I'm here in Kaunas, which is also a result of my life based on travel. I am Dean of Humanities in Kaunas Technological University. I was invited to transform humanities in that university. And what I feel after 6 months here, being here, is this fatigue of homelessness. So this fatigue of homelessness is something found in your language, which floats in between axiological and apophantic. And what I never could explain to my audience is this axiological and apophantic, which you very often use in your wonderful texts. And those terms are used in various ways by various philosophers. So maybe you could help me to answer this question, which I never was capable to answer. And maybe also you could advise me what to do with this fatigue of homelessness. Thank you.
Are you saying fatigue or critique?
Fatigue.
Fatigue.
Yes.
Yeah.
First, axiological and apophantic language. Two levels of language that are used, I hope, that your language, your silent languages float in. Affirmative language and evaluating language, because sometimes language really jumps from one level to another, and I think that travel makes you to do this, to move from one level to another and transform your philosophical language in almost something like poetry.
I think I write naively, and I've always had kind of hesitation about thinking about, what I do, because I think I have an instinctual fear that it could become a kind of recipe if I formulate what I'm doing.
Yeah.
On the apophantic axiological speech, well, beyond that, we had for a while, especially in Anglo-Saxon philosophy, the distinction between fact and value, language of fact and language of value, which now philosophers realize cannot be drawn, or you can't draw a clear line. Already in just affirming what the facts are, you are incorporating valuations. So there's that. But I think it seems to me that in speaking of something and in trying to communicate through words something that you have not, a place you have not been. I so few of you have been to the Altiplano, Bolivia. So on the one hand, one wants to try to summon it forth, to evoke it, try to make it present. And at the same time, it seems to me that the words enjoin and summon a certain quest, what one could call values or better things or the beyond. So it seems to me that sort of shifts quite naturally as one speaks.
Yeah, could you say that travel transformed your language? As simple as that. Because I think it does. Your language of
because
philosophy.
if one wants to speak of other to others places that have moved one, and that others have not seen, then one has to draw upon all the resources of language, not just abstract and commonplace words. Otherwise, they don't really communicate. I mean, you can't just go to the Grand Canyon and write to your friend, "Hey, I was in the Grand Canyon, it was great." In order to really communicate something that's singular, I think one has to pull upon all the resources of language. Yeah.
Okay, I would like to continue about a language, but in another aspect. You talk a little bit about, you criticize at least language, but my question about dialects, local dialects. Local dialects grows from the soil, and these dialects are applied to the soil, and these dialects were developed sometimes hundreds of years. But you come with another language, not with a local dialects, and try to fill lands with the language which is not applied, which is not integrated into these lands. Do you feel the conflict of languages? One of them which grows from the soil for hundreds of years in endless conflicts and dramas, and then another neo-colonist language which you comes with.
I think it's a very big topic, which I haven't really thought about. I mean, in a certain way, it's very disappointing that English has now become a world language. I mean, to start with, it seems to me it's not the most beautiful language there is. In Central America, I went by car in a place like Guatemala, which is 40% Native American. I would pick up people in the car, give them a ride. And I didn't understand the language at all, but the beauty of the sound was extraordinary. It's a gentle and very melodic language. So on the one hand, I don't know what's happening to English. On the one hand, it's dividing into dialects. We have, Indian English. We have even several kinds of Indian English and Black English and so on.
May a little bit continue. You know that Umberto Eco wrote that in the pre-industrial time, somewhere in 17th century, Europe started to lost languages. Because in previous areas, in previous times, one village couldn't understand sometimes the another. Why? Because language coincided with the soil, with the works. Now, when you are talking about differences, for example, like this Indian English or British English or United States English, this is the same neo-colonial languages. It's not from the soil. It's not the same dialects, which I mentioned. The Indian, Native America's languages, probably they have metonymic relations with these soils and lakes and volcans, and your language other. This is tragedy.
Thank you. I don't think I have anything to contribute. I think your thoughts are very sharp and important.
Okay.
Yeah, I went to graduate school in Belgium, and at Louvain, and on certain days of the year, I forget which, there was a farmer's market. And the people in the town didn't understand these people, the farmers who were selling their produce. And that was very recent, you know. It wasn't realized. Yeah.
You people have questions, so you first and
Oh, me first, you said?
no.
Oh.
I don't know what my question, wow, you really do sound weird on this. I don't know what my questions are, but two things on solitude and silence jumped out to me in your paper. One of the only times I feel any real solitude is when I'm somewhere where I have no understanding of the language at all. And I love it because I have no obligation to myself to listen in. And I get to be alone. It's very rare. The words don't cut into me. And you use the line something like the grandest and most overwhelming things there aren't words for. And that's my description whenever I tell people about it of the moment they put my daughter into my arms for the first time. It's the only time in my life where I did not have words in my mind. And it's not the most interesting thing, but an interesting thing about that is I can call that up. The intensity without the language. It's interesting that there wasn't language, but what's interesting is the intensity of that moment. I can climb inside of it right now. I don't have a question. It's just it made me think of that. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, now there's so much talk about, you know, everyone at all times being in communication with everyone around the planet. But it seems we have this compulsion that we know all the time to get away from the talk. I mean, you know, we go to parties and we don't want to get away from this loquacious individual. We want to get away from the whole party. I mean, and I think it's compulsion that's very deep in us. That we aren't just talking animals. We're also silent and solitary animals. So I wanted to try to work out in this text some of the ways, some of the problems we have with language.
Thank you. Yeah, we have.
I don't know, I can't make this work, but you can hear me. Lack of sleep. I think the major problem with the language, modern languages in general, that most of the modern languages rely heavily on what we call in semiotic tradition, only symbolic sign. It lacks indexical, it lacks iconic. For example, hieroglyphics, Chinese language, they actually utilize all three signs, symbolic, indexical, iconic. And going back to what you're saying, David, about the beauty of the language. I grew up in Egypt as a Coptic, you know what Coptic is, the Christian minority. We didn't learn any word of Coptic, and it's descendant from ancient Egyptians, the hieroglyphics. And indeed, it's very moving, and it's very beautiful, very visceral language to hear it even without understanding. So what I'm really offering here, not finding the solution, is it possible that we heavily rely on symbolic representation or sign in languages, and we keep ignoring the indexical, iconic altogether? Your work is really transcending you spoke in English. However, it's very poetic, and that's where the language gets closer to iconic, symbolic, indexical. That's why it's so rich, it's so moving. Is it possible that we actually got so far that language is itself becoming a paradox that we don't know how to deal with? Without language, we cannot communicate, yet it's very limiting in fact limiting to imagination, which has been the issue for me for a long time. If you rely on language to try to represent thoughts, I feel miserably.
Thank you very much. It seems to me that both these interventions enrich very much what I was groping for, is our feeling of the impotence of language. So on the one hand, you speak of this deracinated language, and we could say that uprooted language, and you speak of a language that has divested it and has become only symbolic. I think these are very, very telling and incisive ways of analyzing our problem, our current modern problem with language.
Yeah, sorry, we have people waiting, so.
Are you pointing at me?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know your name.
Dalia.
Oh, Taya. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Pico Iyer.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. You might. I was thinking some of the things you were talking about, the homeless mind and things like that. You might find nice. And just by accident, I was looking him up, and he wrote in 2001 an essay for Time magazine called "The Eloquent Sounds of Silence." And if you look that up, you'll find that it resonates very nicely with this talk. And he quotes Herman Melville saying, "All profound things and emotions of things are preceded and intended by silence. Silence is the only voice of our God." Melville is saying that silence is the divine voice because it's before we cut the world into pieces. But if you're interested in sort of carrying on from where Professor Lingis has started, this little essay you might like. It's by Pico Iyer called "The Eloquent Sounds of Silence," published in 2001. But I found Pico Iyer to be really profound about that feeling of the modern nomad, because I've certainly felt it too. I really appreciate your talk. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for the reference.
Thank you so much for this conversation about silence and languages. I find it captivating. Okay, I need to do this, right? Okay, so I was thinking a little bit a response to what you were saying about this colonizing language, so devoid of the regional and the soil-related language. And I immediately thought about this phenomenon that is somewhat new, but not that new, which is Spanglish. And I thought that the example of Spanglish is quite interesting, because what you have here is the emergence of a dialect in which the Spanish colonizes the English. It's a counter-colonization from below. It's a counter-colonization that comes from taco, sombrero. It does not come from satellites and shuttles and atomic bombs, but it comes from elements of food and elements of clothing and elements of the soil. And for me, Spanglish is a very wonderful metaphor of the limits of hegemony. Or in another word, if you talk about colonization, the colonizer can escape the colonized. It actually transforms from within. So even if we look at the example of English, we see that language being transformed. In this example, I'm speaking about, you were thinking about, how that speaks. To that question, I merely thought about this great book by Junio Diaz called The Brief and Wondrous Story of Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde is, of course, a Dominican way of saying Oscar Wilde. It's a play on Oscar Wilde. But in this book is genuinely written in Spanglish. It's not Spanish and it's not English, and we can understand it fully without English and Spanish. It's a real revolution in that sense. But the most important thing for me, and it's where what you were doing actually was music and image and sound as well, and your voice and language. Well, the other thing that this book does is that it's the silence in between the English and the Spanish that speaks the most strongly in that book. Is that in between, like Eric's this morning, he had 2 moments to his presentation, and in between those 2 moments was a silence. And we were to make the connection as the listener. So I'm thinking that basically one of the things I'm thinking is that art and literature explores that and brings in levels of language that are beyond the symbolic, that are sonorous, that are rhythmic, that there are ways of dancing as well. And so I definitely do not think that English has eliminated in any way the soil, because actually the English have colonized tremendously, and the colonized comes back.
Because so was said about so-called soil language, soil dialect, I would like to respond a little bit, because I mean not only just peasants or dialects, I also mean like contemporary language from subcultures as well, and which is the languages of subcultures, also called fanzines languages. They coincide with the events, with the environment and events, and sometimes people from Britain say that we couldn't understand this one language, but why they couldn't understand? Because this local subcultural languages or slangs, they coincide with the events, with the dancings, with the this language became performative, not normative. And this is again differences. And there is also important, is it index or symbol, because the most important is power, performative power. Does this language inspire you for dancing?
Thank you, Professor Kunas. Can I comment?
Oh. Thanks, Alfonso. Fantastic. El magnifico. Number of things. One perhaps major thing, that mass media, whether it's written or filmic or televisual, they cannot stand 2 things. That is, any little silent moment has to be filled. And it's like Western music. The more noises, the greater the music. And any kind of emptiness has to be cluttered. I compare that to Zen, painting or sounds or no theater. I mean, they're uncluttered. In fact, emptiness is the most welcome thing, and so is silence. And I don't know, what is it about our civilization that cannot stand any little crack, so to speak? We have to fill it immediately. The canvas, well, there's a little spot, put some paint on, right? That's one thing, but what Gintas is saying about the local or soil, it is, from what I have well understood in life, they are not languages about their local environment, although it's part of it, but more basically about how they do things, like how they reap, how they bend, and how they breathe. It's literally body expressivity, body, the way they reap their crops, and then they create sounds that don't have, in quotes, necessarily meaning, but they have the direct contact with their labor. They're being bent to the land. I mean, in Japan, you notice sometimes in a big city comes a peasant woman, and she's like this, bent over. But she goes like with a horn through all the lines and gets on the train. That's her language. You know that she is from that land, and so that we keep excluding body participation. I mean that is a real presence. Maria Gimbutas, you guys know, Lithuanian lady, and what she discovered in her, why she became very concrete archaeologist, that she used to go on a train as a student, and she would get out and watch the women in the fields chant as they were reaping some crop. And that was their language, and they incorporated variations of that kind of, if you want to call it a rhythm or those kind of sounds in their daily communication. So even when we still think of indigenous languages, we have to understand how they act, how they concretely do things. This is like a kinesthetic body that has become sedimented in a particular way. And you can look at them and you know who they are, but the way they walk, the way they bend down, the way they greet each other. That is the sort of a very different level. It's very difficult. You have to more or less participate in their labors to understand how they speak. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. We will have possibility to continue that discussion during the dinner because participants, they are invited into the one restaurant in Old Town of Kaunas. And sorry, we have to finish this interesting discussion actually, because as always in the most interesting place.